My name is Christina Medved, and I'm the Director of Community Outreach for the Roaring Fork Conservancy. And I'm just curious, who is participating in their first Roaring Fork Conservancy program this evening? Put your hands really high so you can see. Oh, that's terrific. And how did everybody hear about tonight? Who heard about it through Alex? What about Roaring Fork Conservancy emails or publications? Okay. Facebook? Newspaper? Radio? Okay, this is really good feedback for us because it helps with our public relations efforts in the future. So thanks again for being here tonight. I would like to give you a quick little introduction to the work of Roaring Fork Conservancy and just sort of put it in perspective for tonight's presentation. So we have been here for 26 years as the watershed organization for the Roaring Fork Valley. And our mission is to inspire people to explore, value, and protect the Roaring Fork watershed. And we do that primarily through one of three ways, for the most part. We have a water quality monitoring program, so we do baseline studies, but also targeted studies. We have our water quality team here tonight if you would like to speak to any of them after tonight's presentation. We also do a lot of policy work. So different from advocacy, but policy work takes the data that we're collecting from the water quality team because the data tells a story. The data will tell us how certain stretches of river are doing. And then if something is maybe off, we can take the data to be a voice for the river when we go and engage with stakeholders to try to come up with really good solutions for everybody, including the river. And then we also have our education department, and our education team is here tonight too. You can talk to them after tonight's presentation if you're interested in more information. But we reach over 6,000 students on an annual basis, which is pretty remarkable because that includes kindergarten through college age programming, and it also includes family and adult programming similar to this. And our reach is primarily through here in the Roaring Fork watershed. So I just want to tell you a little bit more about our watershed. Our watershed is about 1,400 square miles. It's roughly the size of the state of Rhode Island, okay? And how many of you know, you can't answer this, and neither can any of the staff, Conservancy staff, does anybody know what percentage of Colorado's drinkable water comes from snow? You can't answer this. You can't either. All these water professionals. What percentage of Colorado's water, drinking water, comes from snow?
75.
75%.
87.213.
87.213. That's so close. Who said 80%? That is correct. So, where does it all come from? How is it possible that in June we still have water in our rivers? Where's it coming from? Think higher. Think higher. Where's it coming from? It's the middle of July and there's water in our rivers. Where is that water coming from? Snow melt from the 14ers. Does anybody know how many 14ers we have here in the Roaring Fork watershed? Just in this watershed. This watershed goes from Independence Pass to Glenwood, all the way up the Frying Pan to Hagerman Pass, all the way up to McClure Pass and Schofield Pass on the Crystal. So in that 1,400 square mile area, how many 14ers do we have? 7. Okay, which is pretty impressive for one small watershed. You know, 1,400 square miles is not that big of a watershed, is it? The state of Rhode Island, when you look on a map, is it that big of a state? Not really, okay? But I keep using this word watershed. Who's heard this word before? Raise your hands really high. Keep your hands high. If you were going to take a test tonight and you needed to get 100%, and the only question on it is, tell me what a watershed is, who would get 100%? A few of you. Excellent. Would anybody like to volunteer to tell the group what a watershed is? That always happens. Nobody wants to be the one. Okay, Amy, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amy. I'm the director of the library, in case no one met me. Welcome to the library. A watershed is, I'll give it my best shot,
Okay.
the geographical area in which all the water that falls on that land drains to a single drainage.
Brilliant. Okay. Excellent. I'll condense it a little bit more just for the sake of our conversation, but it's land that drains water to a particular river, right? So when you're in this watershed, all of the water is going to eventually drain into the Roaring Fork River, okay? Where does the Roaring Fork River flow into? states? 7. How many countries?
2.
2. Okay? So our very, very small Roaring Fork watershed, it is small. When you consider that we're part of this 7-state, 2-country watershed, our watershed only takes up 0.5% of the total land mass in that whole drainage. 0.5%. We contribute 10% of the water to the Colorado River. I'm glad to hear I heard wows, because that is why Roaring Fork Conservancy is here. Okay? We might be small, but we are a vital watershed to the entire American West. Okay? So rewind about, we're 26 years old, it was probably 25 years ago, that one of our longtime friends and donors, the Berkshires, said, you know what would be really great one day if you have this beautiful river center where you can do all of your work out of, which we do have now, so come stop by and see us, we're just across the river. But it would be really great at that time if you start something called a Watershed Institute, and you would bring water leaders from the region, from the state, from around the nation, to elevate the conversation around water, okay? About what's going on in the water world, not just in the Colorado River Basin, but like beyond. That's how we started the Berkshire Watershed Institute. It started in 2019. You can actually go to our website also and see who our former speakers were, and if those presentations were recorded, you can watch them. During COVID, we were going really strong. We actually became international, if you can believe it, because everything was virtual, and we had people from Central and South America. It was impressive. I think the person who won, coming from the farthest, was from New Zealand. I mean, it was really awesome, right? So we're this small watershed, but we've got a pretty big reach, and these watershed institutes have helped us to make such a reach. And on that note, I do want you all to know that tonight's presentation is being recorded, so if you need to happen to leave early tonight, if we can ask you to go around this side, that would be great. If you could also maybe put your phones on vibrate. When Alex gets started, we will go ahead and dim the lights also, just as a heads up to everybody. So before I introduce Alex, I do want to just mention 2 more quick things. We're really grateful. This is our first series, fall-winter series that we've collaborated and partnered with the Basalt Library, and we really feel like it is even more so elevated the Berkshire Watershed Institute. I mean, what better place in the town of Basalt, in this whole watershed, to come to talk about water at an elevated level than at the library? It's like a talking book. A talking book, not it, but every presentation we've had, right? It's like you're going to get the amount of information tonight. You might have questions tonight. There's probably a book in the library that you could find out some information about it, right? But the other thing is that we've collaborated with the Basalt Library on other fronts too. We just, for the first time ever, started a fly tying club. So I don't know how many of you knew that we teach fly fishing. We call it our favorite handheld device. We teach river stewardship through fly fishing, right? We teach about the aquatic insects, we teach about the fish, we teach about river etiquette, we teach about how to safely handle the fish, and of course how to fish. How do you do that, right? And so the fly tying piece is the piece we haven't done before. Amy's the fly tyer herself, and her and Rick, our executive director, were like, this would be a really fun thing to do. And guess what? We had 12 plus students walking here after school. At some point there was like 14 students, I think. They started telling their friends, everyone wanted to tie flies. This past Saturday, we had our 7th annual iron fly competition at the Tipsy Trout, if any of you heard about it. We had 14 youth participate in that competition. 6 of them were from the club. First place and third place were from the club, which is pretty cool. So we're really grateful for this partnership. Not only is it elevating the work that we do here in the community, and in such a central part of the community, but it's a really great way to dovetail into the relationship that we have with Alex. So because we met Alex when he was at Aspen Public Radio a few years ago, he called Rick and said, you want to talk to somebody about the Trans-Basin diversion tunnels? And I called him back and I was like, I'll just take you up there. And so that's how the friendship started. And I can honestly say that Alex has friendships with just about everybody on our staff. And so watching him elevate his career has been really fun for us to watch, because I'm sure, has everybody heard him on the radio? Yeah, and has everybody read his stories? Yes. Alex is a terrific storyteller, so it was a no-brainer when I was like, I want Alex to tell stories of the American West. And so without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce you to our friend Alex Hager. He covers the Colorado River Basin and water in the west for KUNC Public Radio in northern Colorado and a network of 20 national public radio stations throughout the Southwest. He previously covered environmental issues in the resort economy for Aspen Public Radio and reported on the world's largest sockeye salmon fishery for KDLG Public Radio in Alaska. Alex is an avid skier and mountain biker, so join me in welcoming Alex.
Well, thank you all for coming, whether it is your first talk here or maybe for the night. I'm so appreciative that you are here to learn a little bit about water. I'm so grateful to the great folks at Rockport Conservancy for having me here. And I recognize a lot of faces in this room. I also see a lot of faces I've never seen before. So this is not going to be necessarily a very technical talk, but it is going to be one that gives you a lot of context about where we fit into this picture and where the river fits into the broader picture of the past, present, and future of the West. This is not a complete history at all, but I think that as people who live here, and as people who use the most precious resource, a dwindling resource in this dry part of the country, it's important that we all know an awful lot about it. The state of the river right now is not a very good one. It is being crippled by years of drought, and the people trying to figure out how we divvy up a shrinking pie are having a really difficult time agreeing on how to do it. So today I want to remind you a little bit about who uses this water and why it's so important that however it's figured out, we do figure it out. So I'm going to just briefly go back over my resume here. You may have heard me for the last couple of years, not only from KUNC, but also at Aspen Public Radio, where I was for a couple of years. I was mainly on the COVID beat because that's what was going on for a good chunk of the time that I was in that gig, and also covering as many environmental stories as I could, which really planted a seed for me to take this next gig. Before that, I was at KDLG in Dillingham, Alaska on Bristol Bay, hosting a nightly show called The Fish Report for the world's largest sockeye salmon fishery. And that is really where my passion for talking about the environment and talking to people who know a lot about it got started. And I feel incredibly fortunate. This job is a dream for me. I make a living traveling the West, talking to people, learning their stories, and helping relay that to the greater public. And I want to share some of those with you tonight. So let's start with some important facts about the river. It starts here in Colorado, but more specifically, as Christina said, right here, about 20 feet that way. And thanks to diversions and canals and tunnels, we have split up this river so it flows to people from Wyoming to San Diego, and there are a lot of places that would not naturally get Colorado River water that do. And because of that, it's an incredibly important river, and it's really hard to understate that. 40 million people depend on the Colorado River. More than $1 trillion in economic activity goes on in this basin. That is across 7 states, 30 federally recognized Indian tribes, 2 countries, and it's just a lot of people who are impacted by the decisions about how this river flows. And right now, there is a lot less of it. We are in a mega drought that has been going on for 23 years, the better part of my lifetime. And a lot of scientists are saying that it's not just a drought, but it's aridification. The baseline for how much water we can expect every year in the places that we have come to expect it is getting lower. And all of that water is governed by a complex system that a lot of people are starting to say is out of date and needs amending. It's called the Colorado River Compact. It was written in 1922, and the way that it divides the river means that the people who were there first are the ones who will have it last. When we start making cutbacks to the river, the people who had the first claim, no matter whether or not they can justify its usefulness, are going to have the most legally protected claim. And that makes it very complicated to make cutbacks without distributing some pain. So let's start where the river starts. And we're going to start right here in the Roaring Fork watershed. High in the mountains of Colorado, this river gets started. Like Christina said, 60% of the water in the Colorado River starts as snow in Colorado. So the technical headwaters of the Colorado River, where it first starts as a little trickle, as a twinkle in the eye of the greater West, is in Rocky Mountain National Park. You can actually take a hike called the Headwaters of the Colorado River Trail. It's on the Grand Lake side, if you're familiar with that, where that is. But the vast majority of the snow comes from within the state of Colorado, as well as certain parts of Wyoming and Utah. So this is a story that happened not too far from here. I tagged along on a snow survey. That is a way, a very old school way of finding out how much water is being held high up in the mountains. And like we just heard, this is a great place to tell that story because even though the Roaring Fork watershed is only 1/2 of 1% of the landmass in the Colorado River Basin, it's 10% of the water. So the measurements that we take up here are going to give people an idea of the implications for how much water will end up in the Colorado River. So this story happened just uphill from the Basalt Library, just past Rudeye Reservoir near Nast Lake. And this is a place where they've been doing snow surveys for the last 70 years. The methods and the equipment have basically gone unchanged, giving us a really good data set for how much snow has been in this place year after year. It's quite a trek to get out there. It was a fun one, but a little bit of an awkward one. You strap on some backcountry skis, and you are crashing through thickets and brush and into stumps trying to get to this place that is remote enough that no one's going to mess with it. And this is Stephen Jowen. He works for the Natural Resources Conservation Service. He's been doing this type of survey for about 15 years. And he says even in that time, he is already starting to see less snow at this place. He would say we would come out in April or May, and where 15 years ago there was a foot of snow underfoot, now it's totally dry, forest floor. This is really important because snow functions essentially as a natural reservoir. If you think about the role of any reservoir, whether it be Rudeye or Lake Powell, reservoirs are a way for us to control the natural ebb and flow. Mother Nature is going to give us some really wet years, is going to give us some really dry years, but for us to be able to know that we can expect the same amount coming to our taps and our farms year in and year out, we got to put it somewhere. And we can do that with reservoirs, but nature also does that for us by storing it in snow that, for the most part, predictably melts around the same time and in similar quantities. However, the idea of when snow melts and how much it melts is changing quite a bit. A lot of the West and the majority of Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah, where high mountain snow feeds that water supply, the amount of snow is going down. You can see on this chart here, the red circles are places where we are seeing -% change in the amount of snowpack measured each April, which is about when things start to melt off in a lot of places. In some ways, that's because we're getting less precipitation, but in a lot of ways, this is something that's driven principally by warmer temperatures. We are seeing a lot more snow start as rain, and that rain does not hang around in the same way that snow was and doesn't function like that natural reservoir. And another important thing is that the way we measure snow is changing. So every 10 years, NOAA shifts the window, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration shifts the window it uses to calculate percentages for everything from precipitation totals to temperature. So it used to go from 1981 to 2010. Now it goes from 1991 to 2020. That is a very routine change. The only thing that's not routine is that that decade they moved up is the hottest in the recorded history of the continent. So that means that everything is going to look a little different when it's presented. If you were looking at snowpack data in the Aspen Times or the Roaring Fork Conservancy newsletter 2 years ago, the same amount of snow 2 years ago and today would show up as a different % of average. So that's important to keep in mind when we're looking at this data. But that data is not just numbers. That impacts people. Let's visit with someone in the headwaters here. This is Todd Hagenboo. He lives on the Yampa River in Steamboat Springs. This is a section of the Yampa River running right through his property. His family has been ranching this exact parcel of land for 75 years, and he gave me a little tour around and showed me places where there was not water. Places where he said, as a kid, I used to grow up playing in this creek, and now my kids cannot play in this creek because it is simply just dry land. This is happening in a lot of places. Little creeks that used to flow strong and used to flow long into the spring and summer are no longer doing that. But this is not just my kids don't get to play here. In a town full of working ranches, that cuts into the bottom line. This was not this most recent fall, but the one before. I was out in the Steamboat area, talked with a ranching family that said they weren't getting enough water to grow hay. So they have to buy tons of it, trucked in from other states. And this is happening in one of the wettest parts of the Colorado River Basin. There are a lot of places that rely on imported water year after year, and now we're seeing places that have to feel the economic blow of not having enough water, even near the very snowiest beginnings of the Colorado River. Let's stay in the mountains and talk about another very important component of how we use water in the Colorado River Basin. Can anyone here tell me first of all, where this is.
Independence Pass.
And do we know what it is?
It's the Grizzly Creek Reservoir diversion.
It is a trans-mountain diversion. And this is how we bridge that imbalance between where the people live and where the water falls. This one is right in our backyard. It goes under the road on Independence Pass. This is at Lost Man Lake. Do call on that one. So like we said, more than 80% of Colorado's water falls on the west slope of the mountains, and more than 80% of the people live on the east side. You could not have life in Colorado as we know it without infrastructure to move that water. So a lot of this was built nearly 100 years ago, and it's a complicated network of tunnels and canals and pipes that literally carves through the mountains to move water against gravity and bring it to where the people are. I think this is really illustrative of why the river is so important. It has been divided and moved in so many directions that a lot of cities that we think of as in the Colorado River Basin are places where Colorado River water does not naturally flow. This is not just Western Slope water going to Denver, Aurora, Pueblo, Colorado Springs. This is how Phoenix and Albuquerque and Los Angeles exist, is by importing Colorado River water through hundreds of miles of canals. There are diversions that bring water across 300 miles of desert, and without them, we would not have Phoenix as we know it today. And so we're gonna go down there and talk about the role of cities in this whole mess. Cities, believe it or not, have actually done a really good deal of conservation. A lot of them, including ones in Colorado, are using the same quantity of water that they've used since the 70s, even as they've grown by hundreds of thousands of people. They're stretching a finite supply over growing populations, but that makes access to that water, it makes new development more expensive because they are trying to stretch that finite supply of water over tens to hundreds of thousands more people. And this is a place where we start to see the very visible ways that we conserve water, because a lot of the ones I'll talk about later are fairly invisible. Ways to stretch that water supply include, low flow shower heads and high efficiency toilets and that kind of thing, and new rules about, not watering your lawn. And these are the types of changes that I predict we will see play out in a lot of other places in the Colorado River Basin as that water supply continues to dwindle. But at the end of the day, cities, all of them, I'm talking Denver, Los Angeles, Salt Lake City, Las Vegas, Phoenix, Albuquerque, all of that urban growth uses only about a fifth of water from the Colorado River, even less. Who's using the rest? Agriculture. So we're going to stay down in Arizona here. This is in Yuma. It is a very important part of the Colorado River Basin's agricultural world. About 70 to 80% of the water from the Colorado River is used for agriculture. That seems like a kind of impressive number when you think about that split between urban and agriculture, but the important part about Southern California, Southern Arizona, and parts of Mexico is that they have the perfect climate for growing a lot of the produce that ends up on tables nationwide. 80 to 85% of the vegetables in the US in the winter come from this little section of land and are grown with Colorado River water. So it is easy to talk about agriculture as being a misuse of water, but you also have to remember that the habits that we've developed and the produce that we've expected on our table year round is only happening because we're using the water for that purpose. This is someone who manages an awful lot of agriculture down there. Matt McGuire is the chief agricultural officer for a pretty big grower that has farms in Southern Arizona, California, and Mexico. And he helped explain that they are implementing a lot of technologies to conserve water, but they are still meeting that level of output. Yuma is not going to be losing water anytime soon, but there are other parts of the Colorado River Basin that will, other growers in the Colorado River Basin. But at the end of the day, the role that agriculture has in the conversations about how we share water is one with a lot of eyes on it. Agriculture has a very big target on its back right now because it uses so much of the water. I've talked to people who say, look, you can't cut back on agricultural water use without dealing a pretty crippling blow to places where families have, for generations, relied on farming and ranching, where entire towns and communities are built around farming and ranching, where companies have provided produce to people in this country that will no longer be able to do that But I have heard those same people say this is simply a question of math. If we are going to cut back on water use in the Colorado River Basin, this is where we're going to find the most. So let's stay a little further south of here and talk about a group that often does not have the loudest voice in conversations about the river, and that's the Native American tribes. They control about a quarter of the river's flow, but a lot of times they do not have the money to build the infrastructure they need to use all of it. So they have to let it flow to other people and not use their full allotment. This photo comes from a reporting trip to Hager, New Mexico, which is a sort of satellite community of the Navajo Nation, fairly near Albuquerque. This is what the water looks like in Hager. On the left, that is the sink at the town school, and on the right is a corroded pipe that came out from underground, a pipe that leads to homes. The city's wells have degraded quite severely, and the town's water is black with sediment and orange with rust. I talked to people who said they can't really even take showers in it. I mean, forget drinking, but you take showers in it and it turns your hair and skin and nails hard and just unpleasant. It is because of issues like this, because of degrading infrastructure and the lack of funding that those communities need to build better infrastructure, that nearly half of tribal homes in this country do not have regular access to clean water. On Navajo Nation alone, that is 40% of homes that do not have regular access to clean water. And because of that, people have to truck water to their homes for drinking. In 2023, in the United States, whole communities have to truck water to their homes for drinking. People in this town, in Hager, truck bottled water by the crate load from the Walmart in Albuquerque. That is at least an hour round trip just to get drinking water. Some of them fill tanks for showering, but a lot of people are just left to use that brown, black, rusty, unpleasant water for showering and cleaning. But the interesting thing, and the reason that I chose Hager for this story, is because they are actually one of the lucky ones. This man that you see in this photo is Mark Begay. He has run the town's water system for about 30 years. And he is pointing to the path of a proposed pipeline that would bring water from Albuquerque, a city that gets a lot of its water from the Colorado River. Water is currently on track to flow this year, but the pipeline has been in the works since 2006. It has had permitting troubles and funding troubles. At one point, there was a developer who owned land in the way who basically said, "You're not building the pipeline here." This represents a permanent fix for Hager. They might be able to finally have regular clean water, but the community still does not have a lot of money. It is small, it is remote, and it does not have a lot of economic opportunity. So even though they are getting money from the state, from the federal infrastructure package, they're saying, even if we build this pipeline, we're not going to have enough money to maintain it or to replace the lead pipes that lead from the main into homes. And so when we're talking about tribal communities, this is one of the lucky ones that might not even be able to fix all of their problems with public money. And of the 30 recognized tribes in the Colorado River Basin, a lot of them have similar issues. They have been here longer than almost anyone else using the water. They have rights to a lot of the water, but because of the lack of funding, they often don't have the ability to use all of it. And even when they do have the ability to use it, it's fairly low quality. And really what they want is a bigger seat at the table about how the river is used. There are a lot of conversations right now trying to divvy it up in the face of that shrinking supply, and time again, states and the federal government will say that they are including Native voices and including representatives from the tribes, and the tribes are quick right after to say, no, you're not. I want to talk about one more group, and this is one that I think we're all quite familiar with here in the Colorado River Basin, or in the Roaring Fork watershed, and that is wildlife. What you are looking at here is a beaver dam right in the middle of the Cameron Peak burn scar. This was the largest wildfire in the history of the state of Colorado, and what you are looking at is a small patch of land that was completely protected from wildfire because beavers are there. This is one of my favorite stories to do and one of my favorite stories to talk about. So this is up Cameron Pass, a little bit outside of Fort Collins in the Poudre River watershed. And beavers pulled off a miracle. Basically, beavers, if you have ever seen one, are very awkward on land. They are clumsy walkers, and they are very good prey. However, they are incredibly talented swimmers. Take a look at their fur and tails. They are very well acclimated to being in the water. So when they want to set up shop and live somewhere, they build a sprawling network of streams and canals that they can swim through. They will take a very normal, straight, simple, uncomplicated stream and make it into this complex wetland that is a network of canals and ponds to keep them safe. So what that does is it spreads out water and it creates wetland environments. And that's exactly what happened here. If you look on the hillside behind it, this is completely burned out. This is moonscape, ashy dirt, trees charred to blackened toothpicks. And right here, it is verdant and green and full of life. It's insects, and you can see footprints and droppings from a lot of other bigger animals that live there. The scientist who took me out there is Emily Fairfax, one of the nation's foremost beaver experts. And she was saying that beaver habitats, because of this and many other reasons, are more important than they ever have been before. There are a lot of places where beavers have created more habitat for the other animals that live there by spreading out that water and making very attractive places for other animals to come. And they also are helping humans. Not only are they potentially slowing down the spread of wildfires, they also have the ability to act as small reservoirs. So while this is not in any large capacity going to solve the Colorado River crisis, when we're talking about snow melting off earlier and not being reliable as a natural reservoir, the more beaver ponds, the more you have a little bit of the capacity of snow that's going away being replaced. And the fun thing is, humans have tried to replicate this and have been completely unable. There is something called a beaver dam analog, and it is exactly what it sounds like. Humans have tried to take the technology that beavers have spent millions of years mastering, and they just can't do it quite right. Beavers have evolved specifically to build and maintain that infrastructure, and humans just are not capable of doing the same. All right, so we have all of these uses. We have cities, we have farms, we have indigenous tribes, we have wildlife. All of them have a stake in this river. Where are we starting to feel the sting as it shrinks? Right now, the front lines of that battleground are at Lake Powell. That is the nation's second largest reservoir, and it is currently only 22% full. So this is from Lake Powell in July. I assure you it is even lower than when I took this picture. And this is where the upper basin states, so Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico, store their water. They have a legal obligation to send a certain quantity down to the lower basin states of California, Arizona, and Nevada every year. And they do that by pooling it here behind Glen Canyon Dam, making sure that they have enough to send down. However, like I said, the supply is shrinking and the demand is not going anywhere. So that means that the amount of water in Lake Powell is going down. This is Glen Canyon Dam, and standing on the top of it, you can see all the places where water used to be and is not anymore. It, at one point, was very near the top of this dam. And now, as you see these elevation markers of how many feet above sea level it is go down, the water is way past the lowest elevation marker. So that means big trouble. You know how I mentioned that legal obligation of the upper basin has to send a certain amount down every year? They're worried that the pipes that carry water through the dam, if water gets below there, it only has the option of going through these rarely used backup tubes that are not wide enough to carry enough water down to fulfill that legal obligation. That throws this whole thing into a legal mess, opens the door for litigation, and just turns the system on its head as we know it. But before we get there, before we get that low, there are even more pressing worries. Inside Glen Canyon Dam, there are hydropower generators that supply electricity to about 5 million people across 7 states, and water is very imminently on the edge of getting too low to pass through the hydropower turbines, or the channels that pull water into the hydropower turbines. So I went down to Glen Canyon Dam to learn more about that. This is inside Glen Canyon Dam. We are looking at Bob Martin, who is the hydropower manager, and he is on the threshold of managing these hydropower turbines through the end of an era. This dam has been here since the space race. It is incredible to look at. I mean, standing at the base, the only thing I could compare it to is looking up at skyscrapers in Manhattan. It is a massive piece of infrastructure, truly a feat of engineering, and one that this region was very proud of for a long time. And he says, you know, as the hydropower manager, he feels the responsibility to carry the torch from the decades of hydropower managers before him And for a long time, he's been able to do that. We went down into the belly of the beast, into the guts of these hydropower generators, where the turbine whirs pretty much 24/7. And this is an old piece of engineering. It is a huge, hulking thing of steel, and it is whirring loud. And he says, this is like going to your garage and taking out your grandpa's 1964 Cadillac and making it work perfectly at the first turn of the key, because that's when this was built. But there is a very good chance that that loud whirring goes quiet, and he says that keeps him up at night. I talked to a historian about this as well, Sarah Dant, who is a professor of history at Weber State University, and she says that this is a sign of this country's and this region's reckoning with aridity. For a long time, we have been putting off staring down the barrel of a drying region, and now is the time to do that. And that is something that we have been putting off since truly the earliest days of white settlement in the western US. If you go back and look at the journals of John Wesley Powell, who was an explorer who charted and wrote all about the Colorado River, and he's the one that Lake Powell is named for, he said in a report called Report on the Lands of the Arid United States that he sent back to Washington, he said, look, I can tell there is not enough water here to sustain life as it looks in the green east. And for a long time, parts of this region have ignored that, have planted lush plants that cannot be supported, have spread out cities and spread out agriculture in a way that water was maybe able to support at a time, but could not sustainably support for centuries. So as Powell is shrinking, it's revealing everything that's left behind. This was from this is actually from a separate trip in July when we walked up the side canyons. And as the water pulls out of these side canyons, it is revealing things that were submerged for decades. So in a lot of ways, that is garbage and sediment. It is tin cans and layers of muck and dirt that were deposited there through the years. But it also is some more gruesome symbols of human activity on the lake, and we did not dare check underneath that boat, but it was pretty jarring to see in person. However, there are also some things that a lot of folks say are very positive. There are riparian habitats that are coming back, verdant and lush and beautiful in these places that have been under a man-made lake for years, for decades. And so as we walked up, we could see places where beavers and fish and frogs and birds were living in a place that they simply couldn't before. There are environmental advocacy groups that say it's time to let Grand Canyon come back, in the sense that we are no longer able to sustain a massive reservoir there. It is time to let it go back to being a river. And they point to the things that people said before it was ever a reservoir. There was a time that people wrote about and talked about Grand Canyon in the same way that they talk about the Grand Canyon, also shaped by the Colorado River and not a whole long ways downstream from here. And those folks say that it is time to let Grand Canyon come back to how it looked before. And whether or not you think that's a good idea, the amount of water supply is shaping up so that that might be the only possibility. So in the way that our river use and the shrinking supply is starting to reshape the ideology of how we spread out in the West, there are ways that it's reshaping the West physically. So knowing all of that, what are we doing and what do we need to do? So despite the fact that the water supply is shrinking, demand has not gone anywhere. There is just as much demand for the produce that we grow with Colorado River water. There is just as much demand for water in cities. In fact, it is hard for cities to keep that demand down because of how much they're growing. And because of all that, we are still building new infrastructure to move and store it. This is some of that infrastructure being built. It is the Chimney Hollow Reservoir near Loveland, Colorado, and it is not the only one being built in this basin. So I'll tell you a little bit about my trip there. It is truly massive. It will include the tallest dam built in the United States in 25 years. And when I was there, you can listen to my radio story about it, I was just awestruck. I was seeing trucks bigger than any truck I'd ever seen before. I'm a pretty tall guy and they're like 4 times my height. And they look like regular excavators and dump trucks, but I was told that this excavator could dig out the foundation of a house in 3 scoops. And so those 3 scoops are then put into a dump truck, and those dump trucks are running one every 30 seconds for 9 to 5 for about 2 years. And so that is the scale of earth that needs to be moved to build this dam. So proponents say that it's an investment in the future to make sure that there is enough water for kids and grandkids on the Front Range. I mean, cities over there have been able to flourish economically, and they have been able to see booms in populations because we have the infrastructure to bring the water from where the water falls naturally. And those advocates for projects like this say that we need to keep doing that to sustain life as we know it. But opponents say that that's a foolish endeavor. One told me, you can keep building buckets, but there will not be any water to fill them. So what are our policymakers doing about the fact that there is not going to be enough water to fill those buckets? Right now, they are putting together a patchwork of Band-Aids. It is important to know that a lot of what we see in terms of news about the Colorado River is only ever meant to tide us over until the year 2026. So there is a certain amendment to that Colorado River Compact, the 100-year-old document, that slightly changes the way we allocate water, called the Drought Contingency Plan, and that is going to expire in 2026. The rules for how we share the river are going to expire in 2026, and the 7 states that use it are going to need to agree on new ones. So a lot of the folks that make these decisions say, let's hold it over until then, we can come up with a more permanent solution in a few years. So right now what we see is every year, the federal government deciding to make emergency releases to, this is just for the last couple of years at least, to top up Lake Powell and keep those hydropower generators running. It is state governments coming together to say, we can save a little bit of water, not nearly enough to turn this around, but just enough to keep the infrastructure going at the Glen Canyon and Hoover dams. And we'll come up with a more permanent solution in 2026. The one that we're talking about right now, this very week in fact, and last week, some of you may see my reporting on this, is that the federal government put out a call for input on a plan to conserve some more water. It is called the Supplemental Environmental Impact Statement. It is a very unsexy piece of federal bureaucracy, but it will result, potentially, in less water being released from the nation's largest reservoirs. So, to understand how much water they want, first you have to understand what an acre foot is. That is the main unit of measurement for water in the West. We don't really talk in gallons, we talk in acre feet. So to visualize that, we're talking 1 football field filled 1 foot deep with water. That is about enough to keep your average household running on water for about a year. You can get 1 to 2 households for a year on 1 acre foot of water. So the federal government said, look, we need 2 to 4 million extra acre feet of water in each of the next 2 years if we want to keep things going well in Glen Canyon Dam. And they said, look, states, we are going to potentially conserve water whether you like it or not. Please feel free to give us some input on that idea. And so the states, which are typically nipping at each other about how to share water, actually managed to come to a little bit of compromise. 6 of the states in the Colorado River Basin put together a response to that federal call. And they said, look, we know you want 2 to 4 million acre feet of water. Best we can do is 1.7. So that is the best foot forward from 6 states. California was the lone holdout from that plan. They said, we have our own plan, and it conserves even less than 1.7 million acre feet of water. So this is just a microcosm. This is one in a series of really difficult conversations about how to just hold us off until 2026. And all of these states are still turned against each other. The upper basin and the lower basin, the agricultural community and the cities are seeing each other as enemies in a lot of ways. There is a lot of talk about the need for collaboration, and I do genuinely believe from having conversations with these people that the top water decision makers in this region really do believe that they need to find a collective solution for this collective problem, and they really want to, but it is really hard to do. Because to do that, somebody has to lose water. And if that comes from the largest share, the agricultural community, it has never been a politically popular move to sell out the American farmer. And if it's going to come from cities, you're going to have a lot of angry voters knocking on the door of people in elected office. So these are all really difficult decisions, and it's a standoff. They're almost waiting for someone to blink first, because no one wants to be the first to sacrifice their water, and it's really hard to make those decisions under a 100-year-old rule that isn't fully tuned to the realities of today. And the realities of today are a continually shrinking supply. They are up against climate change. I can talk day in and day out, and I do, about policy, but ultimately, this is a story where science is pulling the leash. Every metric that we have available tells us that it is going to be drier in the coming years. It is going to be hotter. We are going to see less snow. We are going to see drier soil, and we're going to see warmer temperatures. Cities are growing, and there is going to be steady demand for food from farms and ranches. And so it's really a question of how to split up the amount that is left. And I do not want to end this conversation on a depressing note, but the outlook is incredibly grim. The one thing that I will say to reassure all of us is that we are not on a fast track to day zero without water. This is not going to be some post-apocalyptic scenario, but we are very overdue for some serious decisions about reducing our water use, and they are probably going to become a reality in the next few years. There are going to be changes not to life in the West, but to life as we know it. In my professional opinion, there is no way to go forward with a shrinking supply and the amount of demand that we have, and it will be very interesting, and nobody I have talked to is able to give me a good crystal ball projection of how that will go, but it will mean that some people who cannot lose water will lose water. Those decisions are going to shape the future of where we live and what we eat, and they're all getting sorted out now. And I have a lot of people who say there are probably ways to mitigate this. We could pump water in from another river. We could desalinate water from the ocean and bring it to cities. We could use cloud seeding technology to bring more snow to the mountains. And all of those, save for pumping water in from a different river, are valid ways to help add a little bit, but we are not going to get out of this by adding water. We are only going to be able to get out of this by cutting back on the amount that we use. So I encourage everyone here to learn more. I mean, I cannot have a lot of professional opinions as a journalist, but I believe and will shout it from the rooftops that we are all better participants in our world and in our democracy if we have more information. And I also want to say that you folks are all incredibly lucky to be here tonight, and many of you to live right where the river starts. So thank you very much for opening questions. Anyone back there?
Yeah, I really enjoyed your talk, and I just had this idea after listening to you. Is there, in your journeys, are you hearing any discussion about building pipelines for H2O in the same way that we pursued petroleum?
There's certainly discussion of it, but I will say.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh yes, the question was, is there any discussion of building pipelines for water in the same way that we move oil and fossil fuels? There is certainly discussion of it, but I will say the smartest people in the room generally say that it is not a bad idea, but one that will not even come close to solving the problem. The Bureau of Reclamation, the federal agency that manages water in the region, they did run a study about piping water in from another basin. That was largely written off as infeasible, simply because moving water is so incredibly expensive. It's very heavy, and to move it against the flow of gravity, which you have to do if you're bringing it from another basin, takes a lot of energy that costs a lot of money. It's possible that that calculus shifts if renewable energy gets to a point where it's a lot cheaper and we're able to make decisions based on a completely different energy supply. But given the current context, it's not something that I would expect to see anytime soon. This is something that also plays into the idea of desalinating ocean water. This is something that's suggested by a lot of people, both in rooms like this and in rooms with PhD scientists. And basically, we have the technology to do it, but it is very energy intensive and very expensive. So I actually did another story that I would encourage you to check out online, where I went to the largest desalination facility in the country, which is also the largest desalination facility in the Western Hemisphere. It is in Carlsbad, California, and it is, as the largest facility in this hemisphere, only producing about 10, 15, I can't remember the exact number, but basically a tenth of the water supply for just San Diego County. So to do this on a scale where we're able to irrigate these hundreds of thousands of acres of agricultural land or pipe it to cities with millions of people would be incredibly expensive and would require facilities unlike any we've ever seen. And more importantly, it's the type of technology that does work in places like Carlsbad, California, where the cost to move it is very limited because you're so close to the coast. But if we're talking about, getting that water to Phoenix, you're gonna need hundreds of miles of new pipes and of very energy intensive pumps. So pipelines do come up, but when I talk to people who are, economics experts, they basically say, we can do that a little bit, but if we want to save the Colorado River Basin, we just have to reduce demand elsewhere, and that's probably gonna come from agriculture.
Is it true that alfalfa uses a significant amount of the Colorado River water? And I've also heard that much of that alfalfa is then shipped abroad. Is that correct?
That is correct to an extent, yeah. The question was if alfalfa uses a significant amount of Colorado River water and if a lot of that alfalfa is shipped abroad. If agriculture has a target on its back, alfalfa is the sector of agriculture that has the biggest target on its back. It is rather water intensive. It is using a lot of water in the Colorado River Basin, and some of that does in fact get shipped abroad. I will say I don't know about it in incredible depth, but that is all true.
Here,
Okay.
okay. You've painted a bit of a bleak picture toward the end of this presentation, but what's one story you've done in the last 6 months that's really given you hope?
The beavers certainly gave me hope. They're a lot of fun, and the fact that they are creating environments that are resistant to some of the worst effects of climate change. Other things that give me hope are the fact that more and more people are learning about water, and I think that the inevitable outcome of that is that they will be better stewards of that resource. I was working today with Roaring Fork Conservancy at Basalt Middle School, where they are starting a project to have pen pals between Basalt Middle School students and students in Aurora, just basically talking about where water comes from and where it goes. And I think, getting information into the hands of water users at a very early age is incredibly important. So I think I am encouraged by how many people are tuning into this. The very fact that money has been made available for my station to have a two-person desk that covers the Colorado River exclusively, the fact that other publications are adding reporters to do the very same. The LA Times, Ian James is a really talented reporter. Deb Kroll at the Arizona Republic. I know the Colorado Sun added one. There's a lot of publications that are really zooming in on water issues, and the fact that there is more coverage and more public attention, and the fact that we can nearly fill a room with people coming to hear about the Colorado rivers is motivating. Right here.
What are some of the things that are happening in agriculture to save water?
The question was, what are some things happening in agriculture to save water? The farm in Yuma, Arizona that I showed in the presentation earlier, that trip was actually all about efficiency in agriculture. And it is actually incredible to see how it's grown up close. I'll actually go back to this slide so you can see it. But there's a lot of technology in growing the crops that you use. You can see here, these are actually like laser level. This is lettuce, but the same technology is used for the field next door, which had broccoli, and the field across the street, which had kale. They are using laser leveled, machine cut rows to have the optimal level of pitch in the ground to make sure that the water doesn't drain off in excess. This guy who I talked to here said, we can only have the younger guys run the tractors because it looks like a video game console. Like the controls and the screens and the equipment are so highly digitized that it is not like running a John Deere behind the steering wheel. So in a lot of places, there are technological advancements because like cities, these folks have an economic incentive to stretch out their water supplies as far as they can. But even if they are efficient with their water use, it still adds up to the biggest portion of Colorado River water use, and they don't have much of an incentive to use less. Let's go all the way back there.
One of the bigger visible wastes that we see driving up and down the valley is the high pressure old irrigation spray across the field, watering that usually gets reported is that, well, they've got to use it or lose it, And if they don't use their allotment this year, they're gonna get cut next year. Are those aspects of it going away in 2026, or just have the potential to be modified?
Does anyone get that question repeated? The question was about seeing spray irrigation in the valley and the idea that a lot of farms may be using a lot of their water because of a use it or lose it policy. And that is real, that is something that exists. It is far harder to, in practice, like have use it or lose it. I think you don't see a crazy amount of excess water use. The use it or lose it policy is pretty bureaucratic and takes a long time. And so we're not seeing a lot of people necessarily use an excess of water to meet that. But I think it does speak really well to the idea that we are having a lot of trouble making these decisions because of very outdated governance systems. And a lot of the conversation about changing those governance systems is, can we make changes within existing law, like the Colorado River Compact, without opening this up to litigation? And for a long time, everyone has said, look, this is going to get so ugly if it goes to court. And a lot of these issues will likely ascend to the level of the Supreme Court. If you're talking state versus federal, this is like big deal lawsuits. And for a long time, everyone said, I really don't want to go there, and I think we won't. And even in the last few months, I've heard that attitude change. That people are saying for a long time, litigation was the boogeyman in the room, and now we are going to need to make active changes to steer off course from litigation. Like you could talk to the smartest legal experts in the Southwest, and nobody has an answer for how exactly we're going to do anything differently. I don't know if necessarily want to say avoid that, but basically the question in 2026 is, do we make more tweaks to this system? Is it legally possible to scrap it and start over? And is there any political willingness to do that? So it gets very complicated there, and I am far from an expert in water law. Nathan,
Yeah, I have a couple questions that I hope tie into each other. First, towards the end there, you mentioned the top decision makers. I'm just curious who those top decision makers are. Is it departmental? Are they key individuals? Is it going to come down to the voters? And then second, I'm just curious, I understand this is unprecedented, but is there elsewhere in the world that is going through this that the American West is potentially collaborating with, can learn from, anything like that you're aware of?
Yeah, excellent questions. The first was about who are the decision makers who I'm talking about, in that picture signing the agreement, and the second was, is there anywhere else in the world that is sort of an analog that we can learn from? The first question is that the main decision makers who I'm talking about are 7 state principals. Each state has one appointed person that goes to these conversations and quite literally sits around the table and hashes out how are we going to split up the water. In Colorado, that woman is Rebecca Mitchell, who is the head of the Colorado Water Conservation Board. They are not exactly direct peers. They're sort of different appointed officials within each state government. So, for example, we have a water conservation board in Wyoming where they use far less Colorado River water. It is the state engineer's office. In Nevada, only a portion of the state uses Colorado River water, so they have the Southern Nevada Water Authority, and it's the general manager of that. So these are appointed, not elected officials within state governments who are generally incredibly knowledgeable about water and focus on that full time and go to these negotiations, and sometimes are out there posturing and sometimes are quite literally behind closed doors in back rooms going, can you afford to give up this much water? No, can you afford to give up this much water? And a lot of that happens behind the curtain. The second question was about other countries in the world that might be going through similar things. I would say probably the 2 most prominent examples where there's a lot of drought study are Australia and Israel, to a slightly lesser extent Spain. Generally fairly developed countries with similar crises. I do not know a whole lot about this, but the conversation about Israel came up when I was doing the story on desalination, and I think this kind of paints a picture of why it's not a perfect analog, is they have an incredible amount of their water that is either coming from the ocean or is potable reuse, so taking wastewater, like literally taking sewage and turning it back into drinking water. And they have the ability to do that, A, because they were forced to, because they have very acute dry conditions, B, when it comes to desalination, because they are much closer to the ocean, C, because the water use reality is very different. The nation of Israel has one golf course and far less agricultural production. And D, because they are working under very different governmental systems for making those decisions. They do not have a 100-year-old compact that's hard to work within the bounds of.
Given the fact that we have some challenges with infrastructure, with policy, and with some outdoor water use, and going on the old adage that when you point the finger, you have three pointing back at you, what have you seen in terms of a culture of water conservation within people, within myself, within the people in this room, making choices about what they're eating? So who's willing to give up salad? Who's willing to give up a green grass lawn, things like that? Have you seen examples of a cultural shift? Because it's work we do at the Roaring Fork Conservancy every day, every week, every month of the year, trying to empower people, particularly in this valley, who are used to green lawns and vibrant flower beds and so on and so forth. And this is a situation where water becomes an invisible, the invisible resource. The problems are somebody else's, and they're all in the Colorado River, right? None of the problems are mine. I'm fine. I'm the director of Roaring Fork Conservancy, and my water use is perfect. But I still have a green grass lawn. And my board chair right here, Pat McMahon, worked in partnership with the library to plant a different type of turf out here that uses less water. So what are we doing to save water? What are you doing? What are you doing? And particularly, Alex, what have you seen in your studies or in your travels as you've gone through? Have you seen a culture that gives you sort of this exemplary example of we're doing our part too?
That's an excellent question, and one that I think is sort of an analog for the entire climate crisis. You know, at the end of the day, I have not seen a lot of it. I think most of the changes have been forced or cajoled. I think that a lot of people, in the climate crisis, a lot of people feel defeated. And I think in the water crisis, a lot of people don't even know enough to feel defeated. I mean,
That's
the
an
amount
excellent statement.
the amount of folks I've talked to who don't know where our water comes from, how much it takes to water their lawn, how much it takes to grow their salad. You know, it's forgivable. I didn't when I moved here. I learned all of this on this beat. I learned all of this by talking to folks in the Roaring Fork Conservancy and by going to talks at ACES and by hanging out in the valley and talking to people who knew a lot more than me. And a lot of people don't have that opportunity. A lot of people don't have those resources near them. I do think that in some places we are definitely starting to see that kind of momentum. I know just walking around Fort Collins, there's a lot of zero-scape lawns where people are planting native grasses and have rock gardens and things that are less water intensive. But I do think that, you know, beyond that, there's not a ton of voluntary action. And I think that people who are in the know enough to know that they should be conserving water also know enough to know that their conservation is only a small drop in a bigger bucket. I think it will take sweeping behavioral changes to change, you know, the type of food that we have demand for. However, there are instances where mandated or cajoled changes are effective. So Las Vegas is often criticized as sort of the bad example of water use in the basin, and it's very hard to look at the strip in the desert and to see the Bellagio fountain and go, like, this is responsible water use. For people who know a lot about water, Las Vegas is the poster child for conservation. They have some of the most effective water reuse programs, so like a drop of water you know, cycles through the system in Denver X amount of times, and in Vegas it cycles through, you know, X plus 5 times. And they also only use 2% of the water from the Colorado River. They also have an incredibly prominent turf replacement plan. So they go around and they literally have like patrol people who will go and give you a ticket if you are running your sprinkler at the wrong time of the day. And they have big incentives for replacing your grass with artificial turf. And it's possible that that kind of thing will create a culture of voluntary conservation as well, but unfortunately I'm not seeing a lot of it right now.
So having
served on the CWCB and in the legislature, that it's all about policy. It's all about changing Colorado statutes and how we allocate and use water. And it's going to take everyone showing up and talking about that, because when such a small percentage of our water goes to our cities and so much goes to agriculture, there are models for market-driven agricultural systems. Arizona actually has a good water market system. And I would just suggest that we look at, it's going to be a shift. It has to take really visionary leadership. Right here in Silt, we had a greenhouse built, 120,000 square feet, growing greens, growing lettuces, using 5% of the water, 24 crops of then an outdoor growth, growing 24 crops year round. Unfortunately, that huge investment, he had to shut his doors because he couldn't get Kroger to buy the greens. They were certified organic. But that's the future of agriculture. We actually changed the statute to call it a farm, because it's all, we're all just tied up in knots when it comes to policy. So I'm not trying to say, but I'm saying there is hope. I think we can make agriculture more efficient. We can keep, so we're watching a greenhouse grow with 5% of water and the Colorado River water running by it to go to Arizona and California to grow our greens to ship them back. We can be at the center of food production if we just choose to shift to different kinds of environmentally controlled food production. It is the way of the future. It's our only way we're going to be able to sustainably grow food. So hate to be on my little soapbox, but I have to say it's going to take all of us. But most importantly, it's going to take policy.
I appreciate that insight. You are far deeper in the weeds on this issue than I can be. And I also, I mean, this is sort of, I don't know if this is to you or sort of just into the air, but a question that I have a lot about this is, what is the connection between water policy and policies that people can vote on? I think water is something that does not often show up on the ballot, and I actually started reporting a story during the midterms, basically calling up, like PhD political scientists going, are you seeing in the important races in the West, in Colorado, in Arizona, in Nevada, are you seeing people campaign on water issues? And all of these people said, not really. And they just said, if you're in Arizona, you are talking border, you are talking abortion, water is a footnote, I mean, it's just not a hot button issue that people get elected on. But I'm just so curious if that ever changes. I mean, there has already been some movement. These political scientists said, candidates didn't used to have a water tab on their issues page on their website. Now they do. I mean, that's movement in the direction of including water in campaign politics. But the fact that so many of the elected officials who make decisions are appointed, I'm so curious as to where, even if we got information about the river into the heads of every single voter here, how much that would convert into changes in water policy.
There have been ballot questions that have been proposed that would change our water law. And they, for 3 or 4 times, if I have that correct, that has been on the ballot. It keeps coming up. There is a movement in that direction. But when 80% of your population was on the Front Range, with 20% of the water, and you've got 20% of the population in the Western Slope, with 80% of the water, we're a little bit outnumbered. And so it is all about policy. It's all about statutory changes. And we can drive those changes and still keep agriculture viable and successful. Because climate change is going to put them out of business, for sure.
Well, looks like any questions. Thank you so much for coming.
Alex, that was really terrific. Before everybody leaves tonight, I want to once again go ahead and thank the Salt Library for hosting us these last several months for the Berkshire Watershed Institute. If you're interested in learning more, by the way, we're going to keep doing this, right? So, actually 3 weeks ago, we had a local beaver restoration expert here too, Mark Beardsley. He receiving emails from us once a month about upcoming programs and projects we're working on. I do want to tell you that we have 3 more programs going on in March that you might be interested in attending. Do y'all know what a snow tall site is?
Yep.
Those are the, you showed us the picture, you were near a snow tall site there in one of those pictures, but the snow tall sites are usually located in the headwaters of the major rivers here on the western slope, also some on the eastern slope. They are measuring real time the amount of, well, everything. Snow depth, how much water content is in the snow. We also work with Steve Jowin, who was in your picture there with NRCS. He's going to take us to the snow cell site on the McClure Pass. We're actually going to dig a snow pit. We're actually going to see, by the way, anyone take a guess how many feet of snow are on McClure Pass right now? 5 feet, which is a lot for McClure Pass. McClure Pass has historically, at least in the last, how many of the math, 8 years, been more than that, since 15 or so.
13.
Since we've been doing snowpack reports, McClure Pass has been historically below average. It's not really high elevation, it's about 8,800 feet in elevation. It's the second lowest no-till site in the Roaring Fork watershed. It has been leading the charge all winter this winter with having the highest percentage of snowpack, not in comparison to other no-till sites, but with itself. Right now it's at 160% of average. There's over 5 feet of snow up there and 18 inches of that, or 18 inches of water content in that snow. So we're gonna go up there. You should totally come. It's gonna be March 16th. More information is on our website. We're limited to only 20 people. So if you're interested, definitely check out the website. We're also gonna have a snowshoe program at the Capitol Creek Ranch. That's the former child's property. It's privately owned. You can only get there on this program. It is an amazing opportunity to see the riparian area in Snowmass Creek, but also, for example, last year there was so much beaver activity that we were literally bushwhacking because there was ponds where there weren't ponds before. So that was pretty incredible. And then the final Brookshire Watershed Institute for this particular season, of course we'll have more later, but for this fall-winter season is on March 21st. We're partnering with DeKalb because we're going to be doing a film screening on a movie called A River Out of Time. So about 4 years ago, well, it was 2019, a group of scientists, artists, writers actually retraced John Wesley Powell's expedition on the Colorado River 150 years after he did it. Well, I'll just read you the description. In 1869, a small group of surveyors led by John Wesley Powell set out to map the unknown extent of the Colorado River Basin. 150 years later, this group followed in Powell's footsteps to reevaluate Powell's legacy, absorb the unquantifiable power of place, and articulate what the future may hold for water in the American West. If you remember, the last good water year was 2019 when they did this trip. So the video coverage is just as exhilarating as the story content is. So we invite you to check out DeKalb's website. Hopefully we'll see you there. We're going to do our best to make these Berkshire Watershed Institutes continue to be free. But we do rely on support of everyone to sort of help us make that happen. In the back of the room, right under the flowers, there's actually a QR code where you can point your camera to that to find out more about how you can become a base flows donor of the Roaring Fork Conservancy. And on that note, I will say good night. Thank you again, Alex. Alex will be here for maybe another 5 or 10 minutes to take any individual questions.
Yeah, I'm happy to hang out in the chat, and also every slide from here is from a story I did where I go a lot further in depth. So if you have any more questions, a lot of them can be answered in this stories.
And before you leave, if you are able to help us to move the chairs over to that side of the room, the library staff will help us figure out how to stack them. But if you are able to help us